I'm not at all under any sort of false impression that a photography project is going to have a huge impact on the way in which society is organized, because that's ultimately what produces homelessness. But hopefully the work that I'm making could be used by people who are in positions to affect change or contribute to change.
Welcome to Subtext Discourse Art World Podcast, demystifying the world of contemporary art and photography through conversations with the passionate contributors to both of these fields. I'm your host, Michael Dooney. My guest today is Anthony Luvera, a London-based socially engaged artist, writer and educator. His community-driven, collaborative projects seek to empower those who are too often spoken for rather than spoken with. One demographic in particular is that of people experiencing homelessness. We talk about the ethical implications of using photography and how assisted self-portraits are one way of shifting the balance of power when it comes to documenting these societal issues. I really admire the work that Anthony is doing and his dedication to the cause, so I hope you find the conversation inspiring and insightful. A quick reminder to please subscribe to Subtext and Discourse Art World Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It's free and it helps other people discover the show. Now without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Anthony Luvera. Anthony Luvera, thanks for joining me again. It's really good to see you, this time digitally or virtually.
It's great to see you again, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, we were just talking about Arles before we hit the record button, and we were actually introduced by, I suppose, a mutual friend and fellow Australian whilst we were there. It was, I think, nice for me to discover that you're also actually from Perth, so you're kind of a fellow expatriate that's left the most isolated capital city in the world. You do what is you describe as socially engaged photography, or you're described as an artist, a writer, and an educator with a socially engaged practice. Actually, did you study photography here before you left?
I did. I grew up in Western Australia. I went to Edith Cowan University, initially enrolled to study English literature with a minor in writing. And as part of my degree studies, I did an optional module of photomedia, which was taught by the Australian photographer Max Pam. And it was a kind of a light bulb for me. It really kind of showed me a way forward. And so I changed my degree structure around to study a BA with a major in photomedia with a minor in writing. But before then, I really began to sort of engage with photography or use photography when I was a teenager, as many people do. I have an uncle who was working as a private investigator who gave me a camera and some lenses to teach myself how to use this SLR camera. And around that same sort of time, I had a teacher at high school who gave me and my best friend some darkroom equipment. And so we kind of taught ourselves how to use the SLR camera, how to develop black and white film, how to process and print black and white photographs in the darkrooms that we set up in our family bathrooms. And we thought we were really good at it. And we put an ad in the local newspaper to teach people photography workshops. And so we'd have these rather sort of bemused and confused sometimes adults come around to the front door expecting to be taught by other adults. And they were taught by me and my best friend Peter.
How old were you guys?
14 or 15. About 14 or 15, I think, at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, it was quite precocious. And it's sort of an interesting... Well, for me, I find it interesting reflecting on that time now, because I can sort of see how my sort of earliest engagement with photography, some of my earliest engagement with photography was focused around enabling other people to develop their enthusiasm for photography, to develop their skills with photography. And in many respects, that has continued to be the cornerstone of how I work with photography today.
Yeah. I mean, we're both from Perth, so we know Perth is small. And I guess this was the 90s when you were studying?
Yeah, so it was the sort of early to mid-90s. I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head. I want to say 96 or 97, perhaps. It's a bit of a blur.
Yeah.
At the time, I was really interested in studio portraiture, controlled lighting, and fashion photography. I would kind of approach people that I met on the club scene in Perth, friends and acquaintances who I kind of appreciated their style.
Oh, cool.
And I had friends that were working in fashion, and I would just kind of create these photo shoots. And I really enjoyed it. I really kind of loved that. And then I began to work for hairdressing salons who would then kind of submit the work that we created together in competitions. And I had quite a sort of industrious kind of practice at quite an early age, working in that way.
So when did you decide then to relocate? Because you didn't go to Sydney, for example. I was the same as a teenager. Like, London was it. I wanted to go to London.
Absolutely. You know, all of the kind of music I was listening to, all of the kind of street culture, the magazines, the art was all coming out of the UK for me right through my teenage years. I was really into all of the kind of Manchester music moment and record labels like Creation Records, who were kind of putting music out by bands like Ride and My Bloody Valentine, who created these beautiful LPs with a really bold, striking use of photography and design. And I was just really attracted to all of that. And my lecturer at university, Max Pam, would often say, you know, you need to get out of here if you want your practice to thrive. You need to just go. And I really took that to heart. And I think I was 24 around the time that I made the trip. I left with a one-way ticket, a box of photographs, my Hasselblad camera, some clothes, and I had about $100 in my bank account, which is about £30 or so.
Yes.
And which was mad. And I'd never been to the UK. I'd never been outside of Australia.
Wow.
I just knew that London was the place that I wanted to get to, and Manchester was the place I wanted to get to. But when I got here, I realized really quickly that it's a much tougher environment, you know, to develop a practice using photography, and also having left, you know, 20 odd years of friends, family, colleagues, acquaintances, professional contacts behind. You know, I tried to sort of continue my work with fashion and portraiture here, but I just wasn't finding the creative connections that I found as exciting back in Australia.
Really?
You know, it's a really collaborative kind of endeavor. You know, you have a makeup artist, you have a stylist, you have a hairdresser, you have sometimes people art directing, assistants, and then the models. It's a really kind of collaborative endeavor. And on reflection now, I can see that that's kind of what I loved. And in a sense, that kind of collaborative ethos is another sort of strand from my earliest uses of photography that has also persisted through to my kind of work with photography today. But yeah, when I got here, I did what I could to kind of make money, and was working. First, I was temping in music PR firms and was sort of being employed to oversee fashion editorial product placement shoots. And then I did quite a bit of work in the music festival sponsorship circuit, which was a really kind of fun experience for an early sort of 20-year-old to have. And then I began to look after clients such as Warner Brothers and Kodak. And around that same sort of time, a friend who was doing some work for Crisis, the homeless charity organization, this must have been around 2001, because I moved to London in 1999. You know, she sort of knew that I was a photographer and I was finding it difficult to continue my photographic practice in amongst, you know, the kind of day job, trying to sort of make ends meet in London. So she said, come along, take pictures. People love it. Photographers love it. You'll really enjoy it. This shelter that the charity hosts over the Christmas period, there'll be over 1,000 homeless people. It looks amazing.
So
I felt really uncomfortable about it.
What was the invitation for? They wanted you to document the event, or the event?
That's right.
It's not really an event, is it? It's an initiative.
It's a temporary shelter. I mean, the Crisis at Christmas event shelter over the Christmas period has changed since then. But at the time, it was generally one kind of big industrial warehouse that was vacant. They would, over that sort of week period, put in all the infrastructure for people experiencing homelessness to come along and receive assistance with accommodation, with toiletries, with somewhere to sleep, food, drink, you know, doctors, dentists, chiropodists, hairdressers, entertainment. It's a really big initiative.
Wow.
But I just was being a bit sort of flippant and said, no thanks. I think I'd prefer to see what the people I met would take pictures of. And I left it alone. And then a few months later, in my day job working with Kodak, I was working on the marketing campaign for their single-use cameras. I found myself in the perfect position to access a really large donation of just out of date, just sort of expired disposable cameras and processing vouchers. And so I went back to Crisis and suggested that I would volunteer and help out at the Crisis at Christmas shelter, and then set up a weekly workshop in East London to facilitate people's image making of their experiences.
Wow, that's quite a departure from working with fashion and models and makeup artists. Like what do you think it was about it?
You know, I think my sort of formative photographic education was taught by documentary photographers and photojournalists, and a lot of the kind of work that I was exposed to and really appreciated by the likes of, you know, Diane Arbus and Jim Goldberg and Nan Golden and Larry Clark, and that kind of use of documentary, which somewhere sits on a spectrum of street photography, of subjective documentary, and even the sort of practice of Max, you know, which is a highly sort of personalized, subjective record of his travel experiences. And alongside that, you know, being exposed to the critical writings about documentary photography, which, you know, critique the form along with photojournalism, along the lines of petitioning the photographer and the people using the images to be much more mindful of the ethics of representation and the power dynamics between those doing the representing and those being represented. So all of those kind of practices and that kind of critical thinking about photography was certainly on my radar and within my sort of zone of interest, despite the fact that prior to that I was using photography in a different way. Yeah, I think it very much kind of informed my sort of intuitive response to swerve away from photographing people experiencing homelessness in a straightforward, traditional documentary photographer approach to finding a way to do it in a way that was somehow more collaborative.
Yeah, and by the sounds of things, that one experience kind of defined how you would approach your practice moving forward. Like that was a real turning point, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it was a collaborative turn. It was a way of using photography that was new to me, you know, and it was very sort of intuitive. I just had this sort of feeling that it could be really interesting to see what the subject of the document, like how they would approach representing themselves. I thought that could be a really interesting exercise. And so, yeah, on a sort of weekly basis, every Friday afternoon, people would come in and take cameras away and photograph their experiences or the things they're interested in and bring the cameras back. And I'd have them developed in this ongoing kind of cycle of cameras going out, cameras coming in, and photographs being spread out on the table and endless cups of tea being drunk and lots of conversations and the beginnings of relationships. You know, I met a number of people that I was working with in 2002 that I still know today and continue to see today.
Nice.
And that was one of the sort of biggest pieces of learning for me, I think, was that the engine of my practice is the relationships that I develop with people and the trust that we form together.
Yeah. And so from that initial project, how long did it continue for? Because can you finish a project like that? You could do it indefinitely, really, couldn't you?
Well, absolutely. So what happened? So that those workshops got off the ground in around 2002. I think it must have been about 2004 when a participant came in with a business card for a person called Victoria Jones, who was working at the Whitechapel Gallery. And Christian said, "Oh, Victoria's really interested in what we're doing. Give her a call." And I called Victoria and I met with her and showed her some of the photographs that people were making. I'd been working with, probably up to about 200 people by that point, and there were thousands of photographs and lots of really interesting stories that were being told through the images. And she was really enthusiastic and supportive and, you know, suggested we try to put an exhibition together in association with the Whitechapel. And I thought, gosh, that's such a flattering, amazing opportunity, but it didn't feel right. You know, again, that kind of sense of the sort of use value, the purpose of this work somehow not being best served within the context of a gallery in the first instance, in any case. And I said thanks, but no thanks. And then several months later, she got back in touch with me. She moved to work on the public art programme for the London Underground, or Transport for London, which then was called Platform for Art and now was called Art on the Underground. She said, "Would you like to show the work on tube stations?" And I was like, yes, that would be amazing. The work could be seen by many more people in an unexpected way, and many more people that would ordinarily choose to go into a public art gallery. And so I asked for a bit of time and some resource, and I sought sponsorship and support from places like camera hire companies in London, Calumet and Hasselblad, and trusts and foundations like the Arts Council and the Elephant Trust, to enable me to, over the period of a year or so, work out how to use equipment with someone who has little or no knowledge of photography to enable them to create a self-portrait. I felt that rather than just put a selection of photographs onto the platforms in the London Underground, I wanted to somehow show the people that I was working with, but I didn't want to photograph them myself. And so I worked intensively with a man called Philip Robinson, one of the participants, who continues to work as a photographer today. And he and I experimented with a range of equipment, analog and digital, small, medium and large formats. And I eventually settled upon working with a 5.4 field camera with a Polaroid back, a handheld flash on a tripod, and a handheld shutter release. And the idea is that I ask people to take me to a place that has significance to them, that's important to them. I teach them how to use the equipment. We go away, we reflect on the images. We meet up again in another place that's important to them, or the same place. And we continue to work together so that the person I'm working with understands and feels able to take control over those technical decisions, which ultimately have an impact on how the person in the picture is represented. And then we had that exhibition on the Underground in 2005. I think there was about 12 assisted self-portraits. I call that process and the series of photographs assisted self-portraits. It's about 12 people with their assisted self-portrait and photographs that they had made. And then around that sort of time, 2005, I became really interested in trying to find out more about the ethics of handling a collection of photographs made by other people.
Yeah.
And so I was researching community archives and community photography projects around the UK. And I became really interested in a place called Belfast Exposed, which was set up by a collective of photographers in the early 1980s and continues to work today. It's a very sophisticated photography organization today. At the heart of it, though, is this archive that was brought together by these photographers and the community members that they worked with to facilitate their image making. And so when I began to work with Belfast Exposed on developing a new body of work that would be made with people experiencing homelessness in Belfast, and also undertake a more desk-based research into the constitution of their archive as a way to critically reflect on my practice and the archive the collection that I was growing in London, I was unable to work in both places as intensively as I needed to. So I handed over the London workshops to a participant who ran it for many years, and I focused on working in Belfast. So Belfast was between 2006 and 2008. I went after then to work with people experiencing homelessness in Colchester in the east of the UK, east of England. I went down to Brighton, worked in Brighton for several years.
And you're relocating to each of the locations, or you're commuting?
Commuting, spending a lot of time there. So, for instance, a recent body of work made with people experiencing homelessness is called Construct. And that was created between 2018 and 2022 in Birmingham. And in the first year, I periodically spent time working in the kitchens of a support service called Cypher Fireside. The work was commissioned and supported by a really great photography organization called Grain Projects, who were really kind of open to supporting the sort of process-led way in which I work. And that first year of not using photography, but going in, spending time in the support service, working in the kitchens, making and preparing and serving breakfasts and lunches, cups of tea, and helping to facilitate cooking classes and getting to know the staff of the organization, getting to know the clients of the organization was a really important way for me to develop relationships, but also to kind of survey and ask questions about how I could continue to make the work within the service, if indeed I should.
Yeah.
And then after that period of time of getting to know people, developing relationships, I then sort of switch into another phase where I'm facilitating photography activities.
So what's the typical time then? Because you mentioned Belfast, you mentioned Brighton. When you go to a new location, and I suppose you must have to seek out an organisation, or there must be like a main body that deals with people experiencing homelessness in a region. You approach them. What kind of time frame are you looking at? Contact to setting up something that's self-sustaining, let's say, and then you go to the next location?
So it's been several years in each location. So Belfast being 2006 and 2008, and then we published a book in 2011. Brighton was between 2012 and 2014. Before Brighton, there was Colchester, which was 2011 to 2012. Coventry was 2020 to 2021. Birmingham was 2018 to 2022. And over the last few years, I've been working in Manchester, where I've been embedded within a team of focused care practitioners who work with families living in temporary accommodation. So the focused care practitioners come from a range of different healthcare backgrounds. So community midwives, psychologists, social workers, nurses, doctors, and they provide support and services for families who are experiencing homelessness, living in temporary accommodation. And so I've been embedded within that team, developing relationships with the families, co-creating portraits with the families, recording sound recordings with the families about their experiences. And that work has been from 2022 to now. It's still ongoing now. And those are just some of the works or projects that have focused on housing justice issues or working with people experiencing homelessness. There are others as well, and also works that I've made either one-on-one with a sort of a particular individual or other groups of people who perhaps identify as LGBTQAI+, or children from lower socioeconomic households, or people who have addiction issues, and other groups of people.
So if you started working with the people experiencing homelessness around 2001?
2002.
2002. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. So around 2002, early 2000s. And you mentioned, I guess, other communities which are often classified as, let's say, a marginalized group. I'm not sure if that's the correct term. But how has it been then? Because now we're coming up to sort of 2 decades or almost 25 years that you've been working with the different organizations. How does it compare from when you initially were getting involved with people to now, or even when you move to the different spaces? Because you're going in there, I guess you have a non-conventional role when you're going to help out and to volunteer. How is it accepted by not just the organizations, but also the community of people that you're trying to help out, or trying to work with, rather?
Yeah, there's a number of juicy questions in your question there. I mean, I'm always upfront about why I'm there. You know, I introduce myself as an artist who works with photography, who's interested in focusing on issues of homelessness and housing justice. And I would like to find ways to co-create or create work with you about your experiences. You know, I think that before I arrive and start working within a support service or an organization or in partnership with an organization, it's been different for different projects. So sometimes it's because the organizations approached me, or sometimes it's because a photography gallery, museum, or commissioning organization has approached me. And then we spend a bit of time looking for the right organization for me to be situated within. Yeah, it's played out differently in different places.
Yeah.
And the kind of, as you might imagine, in each location, I'm meeting a lot of people and then potentially go on to work with a lot of people too. And so the topics of conversation are many and varied, but quite often at the beginning, there are questions that I'm asked, like, why are you doing this? And what are you getting out of this? Are you getting paid to do this? How am I going to, like, what's in it for me? And these are really important questions to be asked. And certainly I'm kind of thinking about these questions, and you know, I try to sort of answer them as openly as possible, and you know, share as much information as I have about the resources behind the project, about the partners involved in the project, and about, you know, the sort of prospective exhibition opportunities and publication opportunities and other sort of, you know, potential uses of the work afterwards. I forgot the first part of your question.
That's okay. So maybe like a better question, like for how it's perceived, because there's also the expanse of time. Around the early 2000s is sort of when digital cameras are becoming more ubiquitous, mobile phone cameras, and then sort of another 10 years, you've got lots of social media, and we're kind of inundated with imagery, cameras, and they're a lot more commonplace now than they were kind of in the 90s. And prior to that, if somebody had a camera, it was more unusual than it is now. Like, it's quite common to see half a dozen people walking down the street, one of them will have a camera, the other will have their phone out taking a picture. Is at least the acceptance or maybe the understanding of what you're doing different now because of how we have so many images everywhere?
No, that's a really interesting question that you asked there about the sort of progression of the technologies of photography over the past, 2 and more decades. When I began working in the way that I do, it wasn't very common for people to be carrying mobile devices that had a camera on them. Around 2002, 2003, this sort of retail or affordable digital cameras that if you were lucky enough to be able to afford one and have one, there was often a delay between the time that you press the shutter and the actual moment that the shutter opened and exposed the image. So completely impractical. And working with people experiencing homelessness, this sort of opportunity to be able to be given and to use a disposable camera was really novel and met with a lot of excitement, as it sometimes still is today. Yeah. But increasingly what I found in more recent projects where I'm facilitating other people's image making is that they may prefer to use their mobile devices, and many other people I work with will have mobile devices. Yeah. And that was particularly useful during the pandemic because when I was working on the project in Birmingham, which is called Construct, having spent most of 2019 working in the kitchens and then moving into this sort of workshop image production phase of the project at the beginning of 2020, pretty soon after then, the lockdowns began with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think there was probably about 20 people that I was working with at that time. And so most of those people I was able to continue to work with remotely because the support service had to close its in-person services. And so, the whole kind of nature within which the support service operated was completely upended. And so I was able to work with people by phone, by Zoom, and other sort of online communicative platforms to post out disposable cameras and for people to email me images they were making on their mobile phones as well. So we could continue the conversations and continue the work together. And then as the sort of guidance around social distancing changed and public health measures kind of changed, I was able to start working with people in person again in outdoor spaces and it gradually kind of got back to a more normal in-person way of working. But I guess I really sort of noticed that shift in the sort of accessibility of mobile phone cameras around the time and shortly after the Brighton project, so around 2014, 2015.
So with social media?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also the cameras as well.
Yes.
The phone cameras as well.
Because Construct that's recently been launched as a publication as well. And even that one is 2018 to 2022. For when you listed the other projects, they're typically around 2 years. This one's 4 years as a result of the pandemic. Were there other things through that process that you carry through to future projects?
Yeah, I think with each project, I kind of learn new ways of thinking about the work. I also kind of develop new ways of and new methods of working with photography or video or sound recording or other kind of visual methods. So in that respect, each project informs the one after.
Okay, yeah.
And in terms of what happens next, I don't know. We'll have to see what happens with that next project and what I sort of take from Construct into that. But Construct it's a project that I'm really proud of. And, certainly it's one of the bigger projects that I've created. And in that respect, it's possibly because of the pandemic and how that sort of necessitated and afforded more time to work with people. And also because the commissioning organizations were really supportive and mindful of enabling me to do that in terms of reorganizing their kind of expectations or the sort of funders' expectations and the sort of opportunities that were previously in place for disseminating the work. So it was good to be able to produce Construct with Grain and Cypher because it would have been very different had they not been so accommodating.
Because I'm going to ask a really naive question. What is the end goal of each of the projects? Like when you've made the book and worked with the organizations, like what is let's say the desired outcome? Yeah,
I often sort of talk about how underpinning this work is an ambition to shake up preconceptions about homelessness. And I think that what I've learned over the years and through the sort of relationships that I have with campaigning organizations, grassroots organizations, research organizations, and support services, as well as policymakers at local and national government, I'm not at all kind of under any sort of false impression that a photography project is going to have a huge impact on the way in which society is organized, because that's ultimately what produces homelessness. But hopefully the work that I'm making could be used by people who are in positions to affect change or contribute to change. And that might be working at change or impact at many different sorts of levels. Maybe participating in one of these projects has the sort of outcome of someone being involved, being able to develop their skills with photography and to continue to use photography in other areas of their life or to express themselves creatively in other ways. Perhaps the work, as is the case with Construct, proceeds from the sale of the publication have been and will continue to be fed back to Cypher Fireside. So if the work in that way can contribute to some fundraising efforts for the organisation, that's great. There's another strand of my work which doesn't involve photography at all, but is related to the photographic practice made with people experiencing homelessness. It's a project called Frequently Asked Questions.
I was going to ask you that one.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I'm glad you led into it.
Frequently Asked Questions is a project made with Gerald McClaverty, and Gerald, or Jerry, participated in making Assembly, which is the project made with people experiencing homelessness in Brighton. And at the time in Brighton, I was facilitating people's creation of assisted self-portraits. I was asking people to use cameras to photograph their experiences and also to take away digital sound recorders to record their experiences of the city. And I was also working with the community choir to rehearse and prepare for a performance that took place in the exhibition as well. And so when it kind of led to the production of the exhibition, and that work was commissioned by the Brighton Photo Fringe and was the lead exhibition in that year, which was 2014, I was really keen to include in the gallery space information about the support services available to someone at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness from around the country. And so together with an assistant, we gathered together as much information as we possibly could about the charity sector and homelessness. And I pulled all this material together and presented it to participants in the gallery space as we were preparing the curation of the show. And the overwhelming kind of feedback was that this material wasn't actually that useful and seemed to serve, yes, seemed to mostly serve a purpose of marketing the organizations that paid for it. And
wow.
So we thought about coming at it in a different way. And so Jerry and I began the project, which we now call Frequently Asked Questions, whereby we sent an email written from Gerald's point of view as someone experiencing homelessness to the housing and homelessness teams in local authorities around the country, asking a series of questions like, where can I sleep at night that's safe? Where can I see a doctor? Where can I see a dentist? Where can I use a toilet? Things like that. We thought we'd get lots of really useful information come back, but actually what we mostly got were out of office replies that sometimes promised to follow up within a certain time frame. Very rarely did they, and even rarer still, did they reply at all or address Jerry, the sender of the email, clearly stating that he's homeless and needed help. So we printed out all that material and placed it in the gallery space in these little dossiers of paperwork on blue clipboards for people to consider. And it seemed to us to say as much about the state of legislated homelessness support services than anything else. And then an invitation by the Museum of Homelessness to present work in the Tate Liverpool in 2018, I think it was, kind of spurred Jerry and I to do another round of inquiries to even more local authorities, and then to design a set of posters that sort of mapped out the inquiry and analysis of the responses that came back, as well as some excerpts from the responses, which we then presented on a 13-meter wall inside the Tate, along with a section called "What are your questions?", which invited audience visitors to suggest further questions that could be folded into the life of the project, and also to share their experiences. But with that project in particular, Jerry and I were invited into the Houses of Parliament to present the work to MPs on the All-Party Parliamentary Group, which felt like a real kind of, going back to your question about the sort of prospective impact of the work or the end game of the work. It's sort of, if there's a way to creatively articulate lived experience to supplement the more desk-based, data-driven picture that's being drawn up about the experience of homelessness, and I think that can only be a good thing.
No, absolutely. And it's really disheartening to hear that you attempted to reach out to all the organisations, because I think there's this unfortunate preconception towards homeless people, and this is from people on every end of the political spectrum, that people choose to be homeless and that there are support services there, and if they wanted to get help, they could get help. But if I suddenly became homeless, I wouldn't know where to go or what to do. I wouldn't know who to call or who to talk to. And if there are these organisations available, I wouldn't know where to find them, but I wouldn't know where to begin to look for them. And the fact that you reached out to the MPs and the different government organisations to get help, and you were largely met with out of office replies or we'll get back to you, it shows you how much window dressing I think happens, and that as a general population, we're given the impression that the government or the powers that be are providing a service and they are doing something. But then if you're in a position where you have to get that help and to try to change your situation, you just get an answering machine.
Well, so here in the UK, each sort of region is referred to as a local authority or a borough or a council. Okay. And within the sort of local government structure of that local authority, there will be a housing and homelessness team. And in order to receive or to be recognised or to receive support as a person experiencing homelessness, you first need to register with that local authority as homeless. And that will then sort of theoretically unlock a range of support services for you to get you accommodated and to get you the support that you might need. So it's not to say that there isn't great work being done by local authorities and by the homelessness support sector at large. There is brilliant work being done. But, I think that what frequently asked questions demonstrated in the 3 iterations that we did with frequently asked questions in, was it 2014, 2018 and 2019, is that maybe there's something about the kind of culture of care within the local authorities at large. So what was really fascinating is that sometimes, even though an email may go straight to the homelessness team or whatever it's referred to locally within that council, it may come back from another department, or it would go to what you would expect to be the housing and homelessness team within the local authority, but actually it may be a third party subsidiary. So just the ways in which these kind of structures deal with the inquiry really kind of varied. Yeah, it was kind of interesting. But the presentation of that work, I thought, was also a kind of an aspect of my practice which enabled me to kind of work differently as well. And not only the kind of participative kind of research exercise undertaken with Jerry, resulting in a text-based work presented as a series of posters, but really it's not about what's on the walls. It's about how the kind of engagement program that we developed to support each of the iterations of the works being shown in public spaces and in galleries took place. So, for instance, at Tate Liverpool, there was a practical workshop on how to squat commercial properties that was facilitated by a group called Established Beyond. There were film screenings by local activist filmmakers about the squatting movement. There were more sort of formal, traditional panel discussions by people working as CEOs for homelessness charities or lawyers or people working within local government or academics, and also from across the kind of political spectrum. There were performances by a choir called the Choir with No Name, which is a choir made up of people experiencing homelessness, and other kinds of ways of engaging specific audiences to come in and to the gallery or to see the work and to kind of spend time considering the issues at stake in the work.
Yeah, definitely. But so that was a publication as well, the frequently asked questions, or how was that presented or exhibited?
Yeah, so the first iteration was in 2014, as I mentioned, was a sort of little seemingly informal clipboards. In 2018 in the Tate, it was a 13-meter display on a wall of posters, as well as the public engagement program. And then in 2019 and 2020, there was an exhibition of the work in Bristol at the People's Republic of Stokes Croft in a community activist-led space where we presented all three kind of iterations of frequently asked questions. And then in London, the work was shown on the fifth floor of a bookstore on Charing Cross called Foyles, in the gallery at Foyles, which is a really busy space. And the exhibition at Foyles was from November, December 2019 through to February, March 2020. After the exhibition and the public engagement program, the plan was to then send out a publication to people working in local authorities, people working across the homelessness sector, and policymakers at local and national government. But then the lockdowns happened with the pandemic.
Yeah, okay.
And what came along with that was an initiative called Everybody In, where the UK government supplied local authorities with funds to be able to house people experiencing homelessness temporarily in the hotels which were vacant, which were empty. And then in each of those hotels and in the different local authorities, various kind of support services would work with people. So it was a really kind of brilliant idea, which credit to the campaigning organizations which really lobbied hard and pushed for the government to do that. But what it demonstrated is that, homelessness is a political choice, and that given creative thinking, given the deployment of resources, real practical steps can be taken to reform the way in which a country, a government deals with homelessness. And so sending out the frequently asked questions publication at that moment just wasn't the right time. And so we waited until plans for the Everybody In scheme to stop were announced, when the local authorities were no longer able to provide the emergency accommodation. We thought that was a really good moment to send out the publication, with a cover letter, which kind of encouraged people to use this moment and the lessons learned from the Everybody In scheme as a way to think about how to kind of view the frequently asked questions information, but also how to deal with homelessness support in the future.
Absolutely.
So that publication was disseminated through targeted kind of mail out, which then opened up a range of discussion and conversation and approaches back to me and Jerry from MPs, from council leaders, and from people working in homelessness and housing teams, which was really unexpected, but also hoped for, and ultimately, really kind of encouraging, because the feedback overwhelmingly was that the project really kind of showed them how their individual local authorities could perhaps work better, and different individuals had specific kind of narratives or feedback to kind of give about how the project kind of impacted the work that they do.
Oh, that's really good. Even that, whatever perception we may have of people in those government positions, they know that homelessness exists, but at least maybe through the research with some of the projects, they can see that perhaps there's inefficiencies in their way of delivering services to people, that like a small MP or somebody that's on the local council say, this is something that I can do to fix, even though I can't fix the whole problem. Like, I can at least do my little piece to improve things. In the time that you've been making the work, do you think the number of people experiencing homelessness has increased or stayed the same or gone down?
Oh, it's absolutely increased.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Just kind of observationally, I can tell you that, especially after the 2008-2009 financial crash, the numbers of people on the street rose dramatically. And then I thought we were at a crisis level before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened. And despite what I was saying about the great work that did take place with the Everybody In scheme, homelessness rose. And I spent most of the summer in 2020 working in central London, on the streets of central London, to create assisted self-portraits with people for a commission by the Financial Times, who'd commissioned a social affairs correspondent to write an article about homelessness in the time of the pandemic, and myself to create these images of people experiencing homelessness and the grassroots organizations. And in Trafalgar Square, there'd be at least 4, sometimes 6 charities providing, whether it's food or some other kind of clothing or drink or sleeping bags and tents at any one time, with queues upon queues. Like, it was enormous. And today, walking around the streets of London, it's not uncommon to see people sleeping rough. And the thing is, Michael, is that of course, it's a tragedy that there are people sleeping rough. But people sleeping rough is just the tip of the iceberg of the homelessness crisis in Britain. And to kind of talk with some figures for a moment, there's something like around 3,900 people estimated to be experiencing street homelessness in England today, or in the UK today. Whereas there are around 109,000 households in temporary accommodation in England, which includes 142,000 children. So there's 142,000 homeless children right now in England,
wow,
which is extraordinary. So we are living in a time of national emergency in relation to housing and homelessness. And I think too often the perception is that homelessness only occurs on the streets, but actually the kind of hidden homeless is the real kind of iceberg of the problem here. And to kind of give you a bit more of a sense of this, it's estimated that there's something like 1 in 50 Londoners are living in temporary accommodation today. So there's 1 in 50 people are experiencing homelessness in London. And yeah, it's an extraordinarily huge issue.
I've definitely seen it a lot more, like since coming back to Australia, like in the last year. Even just the number of people that you see that are living in their cars, you know, you have like this run of bad luck, and I don't know what the stat is for people who are only like 2 or 3 paychecks away from being kicked out of their house in general, but you realize how precarious life is and how it can be so easy to end up in that situation, and that it isn't just drunk men that are mentally ill that are homeless. Like, there's families and children that are homeless, and yeah, that we live in like rich modern societies and we have homeless people.
No, it's extraordinary. And I think in the work that I've been doing with families living in temporary accommodation, you know, it really kind of, my own sort of preconceptions were shifted. And that's the kind of tragic thing about the work, really. I've been making work on homelessness and housing justice issues for over 20 years now, and I'm still kind of being shocked by it. But the number of children experiencing homelessness in the UK is enormous. And look, there are many reasons why someone experiences homelessness, whether it's relationship breakdown, domestic violence, people experiencing mental health issues, addiction problems, and other kind of pressures which kind of destabilize, you know, someone's ability to be able to afford accommodation. But it's, you know, I think that there is a long way to go to really kind of adjust how we as a society understand the experience of homelessness and the causes and consequences of it, and how politically countries find ways to reform expenditure and resources to provide housing as a human right.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe to finish on a more, let's say, empowering note for photographers and artists listening who perhaps want to use their creative energy as a force for good and not just create beautiful objects to put in a gallery or work towards exhibitions, but really, I want to help improve my community, or I want to really put a positive message out there, and I want to do something that is like that's truly meaningful, but I'm afraid of hurting rather than helping and not really actually benefiting in a cause. Like, a lot of people, even when they do the wrong thing, their heart is often in the right place. As someone that's been doing this for like a good 25 years, what are maybe perhaps some questions that people can ask themselves, or things that they can do to help realize a project similar to how you're working with people experiencing homelessness? If someone else has part of an idea, or they've recognized a community that they want to work with, what's perhaps some things that they should consider?
You know, I think you mentioned something there that I thought was really important, and I often sort of talk about this when I speak with friends and colleagues and other artists and photographers at all stages of their career, and something that I always want to try and keep in check myself, which is that good intentions are not irreproachable. Just because you want to do good doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. And so, you know, for me, one of the things that I've learned is that, you know, there are all kinds of ways that we can use photography, and the way that I want to use it doesn't mean that it's any less or any more than another person's way of using it. But for me, ultimately, you know, I'm interested in trying to address the power imbalance between myself and the people I make pictures of. And especially when working with people who are overly spoken for and who are overly represented and under consulted about how they're represented. So I think the first question is to ask, should I even be doing this?
Yeah,
and
okay, that's a good one.
If so, how can I connect with the people that I want to work with to really kind of see them as the expert who can help guide you in the work that you want to create? And it's not to say that things will always work out in the way that you expect them to or work out well, but those times when things don't work out in the way that you expect them to are the most valuable moments of a creative practice, I think, because it's a way of taking stock of what you did and how you could perhaps do things differently the next time. I don't know if that really answers your question, but there's some of the things that come to my mind.
I think that's a really important one, though. Should I intervene? Should I help? Should I be inserting myself in that situation? I think that's a good question we can probably ask, not just in these circumstances, but in a lot. If, is my help actually needed? Am I making the situation better or worse by inserting myself into it? And I think certainly with these sort of sensitive topics, and it's also, I think, easy to forget that it's other people's lives, as much as their subject matter and interesting topic and a project, it's other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that for me is what's so exciting about the work that I do. I love getting to know people. I love getting to know people and hearing about their ideas and opinions and experiences of the world. And not everyone that I work with wants to be in the projects. And sometimes they change their mind after the work has been out there and exhibited and published. And I'll do what I can to scrape back. But, you're absolutely right. It's people in your pictures.
Yeah.
And, I think that's something that is so important to be mindful of.
Well, it was really good speaking to you again, Anthony. Like, I always enjoy our conversations. I know we weren't quite deep with the conversation, but I think the subject matter, that's kind of unavoidable. Thanks for sharing the insight to the important work that you're doing. If people want to support you in any way, or at least find out about what you're involved with, what's the best way that they can reach you and find out more? My website is my surname.com, luvera.com, Luvera.com. And my Instagram handle is Anthony_Luvera. Yeah, I'm always happy to hear from people. Michael, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you on your podcast. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Anthony. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Anthony Luvera. To learn more about his socially engaged artistic practice, visit his website, luvera.com, and follow his updates on Instagram at Anthony_Luvera. Links to both are included in the show notes. Don't miss the latest episode of Subtext and Discourse Art World podcast by subscribing to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you think your friends or colleagues would enjoy the insights from my guests, then please feel free to forward them a link to the show. You're also welcome to send any comments, feedback, or questions about this or previous episodes of the podcast, whether through the contact form on my website or via social media. That's all for now. Thanks again for tuning in. My name's Michael Dooney, and you've been listening to Subtext and Discourse.